Does anybody know how many pages the tax code actually is? Put your hand up if you know to the nearest thousand. 17,000, so it's quite a very complex sort of document. And the other...
Come in there and simply say, on electricity, the planning rules also rank to those kind of numbers, and they're now down to 50 pages. Right. It can be done.
And the other question I've got is, does anybody know how many people work in Revenue and Customs as a government department? Again, Richard and John, don't put your hands up. Oh no, you worked for the department. Somebody who doesn't work for the department. I know you've left, but you'll know. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So in 2005, it was just under 100,000. The figure now is 56,000. And what we were looking at back in March is we were looking at a new 2,400 new jobs being created in compliance. This was at a time when we knew that there was a 93 million black hole in the staffing budget. These posts were coming forward as unfunded posts. Unfortunately, with the announcement last week by the Chancellor of £80 million further cuts, that's 173 million. They're really, it is really a desperate situation in Revenue and Customs. So I just want to talk a bit about PCS. We represent 44,000 of the 56 members of staff in the department, and we set up a tax justice campaign. I set up a tax justice campaign in 2008, and I set that up to try and actually use it as a tool, not just to defend our members' jobs in the services, but also as an argument against austerity. And usually when I talk about tax justice, it's all riddled with everything to do with austerity, and I'm a rabble-rouser, but I'm not going to do that today because I know it's a different audience. So I usually do that outside on my megaphone. Anyway, the explosion of anger around, and I do call it tax dodging, we feel at PCS really came to the fore with the grassroots activism of You Can Cut. There have been tons of work that have been done by the Tax Justice Network, which was set up obviously by Richard and John back in the early 2000s. But I really think it was the young kids getting out on the streets saying, Vodafone, pay your taxes, Topshop, pay your taxes, which actually led to getting it out into the public consciousness. So for instance, in 2008, when I went to the TUC and I asked if they would give me some assistance for a tax justice campaign, I got told, Cathy, go away. If you can make tax interesting and sexy, then we might help you. Well, look where tax has come, and that's nothing to do with me. That's to do with the fact that it's got into the public narrative, it's got into the public domain. And this isn't also to say that tax dodging wasn't around before 2010, because obviously it was, and the previous Labour government did far too little to deal with it. One of the things that I think has helped take tax forward is that there's been a coalition of NGOs, trade unions and civil society working together. I think up until about 2010 you didn't generally see trade unions working with organisations like Oxfam, War on One, and we at PCS have sort of feel that we've led the way in terms of doing that and working with You Can Cut, such that when we went to meetings at other trade unions, sometimes they were often a little bit frightened about who we were inviting to the table because they viewed people as being, a bit too revolutionary. But we think that that has been the way to take it forward, to have the broadest possible base. And what we've done is we've tried to work with people on the things that we can work with people on, that we can agree with them on, and sort of not concentrate too much on the things that we don't agree with them on. So for instance, at PCS, we work with the TUC and the Robin Hood tax campaign, but there's elements of that campaign that we don't necessarily agree with, but we work on the bits that we do. Now, all the things that Richard's called for in his slides, we at PCS absolutely endorse, and we work very closely with Richard, with the Tax Justice Network, with Tax Justice Research, and with the Fair Tax Mark. So I'm really pleased that I've been invited to speak today, although I'm quite nervous. But one of the things about what Richard's called for, and we absolutely agree that these things need to be brought forward, but how will it work? Because we've been arguing for years at PCS, close the tax gap, which stands on our latest figures at £119 billion, have a natural anti-avoidance rule, and properly resource Revenue and Customs. But they're all interlinked, because the thing is, if you don't properly resource Revenue and Customs, it makes little possibility of any new legislation that's brought in being enforced. And the situation in the department is absolutely dire. So I've got here, is HMRC adequately resourced? No. And we're not alone in recognising this. Within the accountancy profession itself, there's been calls for HMRC to be properly resourced. I spoke at a Public Accounts Committee event at the Guildhall last October, and I was delighted at the end of it that the head of tax for the CBI came across and said he completely agreed with PCS's views on how the department should be resourced. So it's not just us as a militant trade union, as we're often seeing, it's the head of the tax at the CBI, and I think that's a good endorsement. There's been growing consensus in civil society that HMRC is not adequately resourced, and from individuals trying to get through to speak to an advisor to business commentators. And I've already said that the number of staff working in Revenue and Customs has gone down from 100,000 to 56,000. Now, you don't have to be an economist to know, or an academic, and I'm sure there are lots of economists and academics here, but to know that if revenue's falling off a cliff at the same time as we're losing staff, and a compliance officer who gets paid around 30 grand brings in a yield of 958 grand a year, if you're cutting the very jobs, the very people's posts that are responsible for bringing in, for enforcing, assessing and bringing in the taxes, and you're cutting those jobs at a time when public revenues are dwindling, it's actually the economics of the madhouse. It's not the economics of recovery. So I've mentioned that there were jobs that were going to be put in place. We hoped back in March, 2,400 of them. It looks very likely that those posts won't happen. And the situation within the department is such that I'm going to read out a quote from a senior tax officer. She says, "There's an awful lot of frustration, particularly amongst compliance, constant reorganisations and refocusing of work without the department having an understanding of what that's like. People are put into new units before there's clarity on work. There's a problem in finding cases as they're shunted around the country and they end up with a fourth or the fifth caseworker on them. Last year, yields dropped off targets weren't met because of the reorganisations in lines of business. There's real evidence that with penalties for late tax returns now not being pursued anymore in the same way because of resource problems, that it's likely to lead to further tax avoidance and evasion. The pay freeze is having a real impact on pay levels, which means particularly in areas where people's skills are marketable, that we're losing skilled staff and young staff in particular." And this is something that the National Audit Office report said last week. It talked about the dire state of affairs in the department, not just to do with the resources, but to do with how it's managed. And youngsters are getting out and moving on because they're not getting progression or the rate for the job, and this is from a senior officer with 25 years experience. So in a nutshell, tax dodging is far easier now as we do not have enough resources to tackle it. HMRC is no longer fit for purpose. Now, the Chief Executive, Lynn Homer, last week, she said it was disappointing that the Chancellor had brought forward these cuts, and she actually put out a statement on the intranet which was quite remarkable for a sitting permanent secretary to put out. It shows the desperation of senior management within a department who were actually hoping, I think, that the £93 million in the budget deficit for staffing would go unnoticed if there was a change in government, that they would simply go and ask for a bit of extra money and it would all be covered up. But of course you've got a Conservative government, Osborne is still there as the Chancellor, so that makes it much harder for senior management in Revenue and Customs to cover up the fact that there is a great deficit there. And issues of tax dodging and tax justice are of profound importance to anybody who cares about social justice and equality, fairness, sustainability, and effectively who pays in society. The tax gap, avoided and evaded and uncollected, as we already said, stands at £119 billion. Tax avoidance, in our most recent estimates from a piece of research that Richard did for us at PCS, his figure and our figure that we go with is 19.1 billion, whilst tax evasion is 82.1 billion. But we think that the tax avoidance issue is really, really important. It might be less of an amount of money, but the thing about tax evasion is we know it's criminal. Tax avoidance, although we know it's immoral, is still legal. That's where we think we really have to change the narrative in the public's mind, because if you can get people in the public to think that tax avoidance is wrong, and lots of people do, then I think that's how we take things forward. We want to get to a situation where tax avoidance measures are not just legislated against, but eradicated. And we won't do that with a department that's poorly managed or has got inadequate resources, which is why, therefore, we need much more pressure on the government to properly resource the department that collects in the money that pays for the public infrastructure. Thank you very much.